Okay, so you sent us this, let's just say, spirited analysis of the whole U.S.-Iran situation.
Yeah.
And, well, it's definitely got some strong opinions in there,
Mm-hmm.
coming from a pretty specific angle, you know?
Okay.
So how about we take a deep dive into what's actually happening,
Right.
try to separate fact from opinion,
Absolutely.
and see what we can learn.
Sounds good.
It seems like this source is really playing up the fear factor, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's interesting how this source taps into like a common anxiety around U.S.-Iran relations. Things are definitely heating up.
Yeah.
And when people feel uncertain,
Right.
they kind of gravitate towards information that offers like a clear-cut narrative.
Yeah.
Even if that narrative is rooted in fear.
Yeah, and the source jumps right into this whole idea of a media blackout and how we're not getting a real story.
Right.
But before we go down that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
let's start with something a little more tangible that they mention.
Okay.
These massive Iranian military drills near the Strait of Hormuz.
Okay.
What's the deal with those?
Well, those drills did happen.
Okay.
And to understand why they're significant, you have to picture the Strait of Hormuz, like a superhighway, but for oil tankers.
Oh, okay.
It's this narrow passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean.
Yeah.
And something like 20% of the world's oil supply flows through it.
Wow.
And over a third of all oil shipped by sea.
Okay, so basically, if things get blocked up there,
Yeah,
it could cause a major global energy crisis.
exactly.
No wonder people are on edge, especially considering the U.S. and Iran aren't exactly best buds right now.
Exactly. Historically, whoever controls these kinds of strategic choke points
Yeah.
has a lot of power.
Yeah.
It's a way for countries to exert influence on a global scale, even if they don't intend to completely shut things down.
Right.
Think about the Suez Canal crisis back in the 50s.
Oh, yeah.
That completely disrupted global trade for months.
Yeah.
And even today, countries constantly jockey for position around important straits, like the Strait of Malacca in Southeast Asia.
So Iran making a show of force in this vital oil route definitely sends a message.
Right.
But this source goes a step further,
Go on.
claiming there's a media cover-up about Iran's real intentions and tying this whole situation to Russia.
Okay.
They even mention this professor who supposedly debunks any notion of conflict with Russia.
Yeah, it's true that U.S.-Russia relations are incredibly complex.
Right.
There are definitely areas of tension and disagreement.
Yeah.
But to say there's no conflict at all
Right.
is an oversimplification.
Yeah.
This source is presenting a very black and white view of a very nuanced reality.
And that's where their reliance on anecdotal evidence and lack of solid proof gets a bit iffy. They keep saying, nobody's talking about this or the media's ignoring it, but they don't offer much to back up their claims.
Yeah.
I'm starting to get the feeling they're cherry-picking information to fit a specific narrative.
It's a common tactic for sowing distrust in established institutions by claiming to have insider information that the mainstream media is suppressing.
Right.
They position themselves as the sole source of truth.
Yeah.
Appealing to folks who are already skeptical of traditional sources.
Okay, so let's move on to another incident the source brings up.
Okay.
This one where Iranian forces supposedly detained some U.S. sailors, and there was this whole cover-up.
Right.
They claim these were specialized combat craft that don't just lose power, and hint at some kind of missile attack that prevented the sailors from calling for help. What actually happened?
Well, there was an incident in early 2016 where 10 U.S. Navy sailors were briefly detained by Iranian forces. The official explanation is that 2 U.S. Navy patrol boats strayed into Iranian waters due to mechanical problems and were released the next day.
Okay, so that part checks out.
Right.
But the source's theory about disabled ships and a missile attack seems a little far-fetched, don't you think?
Right. They're presenting a completely different interpretation, suggesting Iran deliberately attacked the U.S. vessels. They even allege a cover-up by the Obama administration to downplay the whole thing.
So we have these two starkly contrasting narratives.
Yeah.
And it's tough to know what to believe without more information.
Right.
Did they ever release the navigation logs or communication records?
Unfortunately, a lot of the details surrounding the incident remain unclear.
Okay.
This lack of transparency fuels speculation.
Right.
Without access to those records, it's hard to definitively refute the source's claims.
Yeah.
But we also have to consider the possibility that they're pushing this narrative to promote a certain agenda or reinforce existing beliefs about Iranian aggression.
Okay, things are getting pretty heavy here.
Yeah.
We've got military drills near a critical oil route, accusations of media manipulation, conflicting accounts of a potentially serious international incident.
Right.
And on top of all that, yes,
the source throws in this whole thing about the petrodollar and economic warfare.
This is where they start weaving these disparate events into a narrative of impending doom.
Exactly. They claim Iran is trying to depeg oil from the U.S. dollar.
Right.
And that this could have, like, catastrophic consequences.
Yeah.
Honestly, I'm a little lost on this one.
Okay.
Can you break down what the petrodollar is and why it matters so much?
Think of the petrodollar system like this.
Okay.
It's basically the global agreement that oil is bought and sold using U.S. dollars.
Okay.
This emerged after World War II and has really solidified the U.S. dollar's position as the world's leading currency.
So it's been around for a while.
Yeah, decades.
Okay.
It means that countries that want to buy oil need U.S. dollars first, which creates constant demand for the dollar, benefiting the U.S. economy.
So if Iran started selling oil in, say, euros or yuan, it could weaken the U.S. dollar's position.
That's the source's argument.
Oh, okay. They're claiming that Iran is deliberately trying to undermine the petrodollar, linking it to those military drills and the incident with the sailors as part of a larger coordinated effort.
Wow.
It's interesting because after World War II, the Bretton Woods Agreement really established this system.
Right.
You had organizations like OPEC rising to prominence alongside it.
It's been the standard for decades.
Yeah.
But has Iran actually taken concrete steps to move away from the dollar?
There have been talks
and
some limited attempts by various countries, including Iran, to explore alternatives for oil trading. But the petrodollar system is still very much the norm. There have even been situations where countries tried to challenge the system.
Oh, really?
Like when Saddam Hussein attempted to sell Iraqi oil in euros back in 2000.
Wow.
Which ultimately contributed to his downfall. It just shows how deeply entrenched this system is.
So maybe the source is overstating the immediacy of the threat, but they make it sound like the U.S. dollar losing its top spot would be the end of the world. Would it really be that bad?
Well, it's true that the global economic landscape is constantly shifting.
Right.
Any major changes to the reserve currency would likely happen gradually, not overnight.
So we need to keep things in perspective.
Right.
The petrodollar isn't going away tomorrow.
Yeah.
But it's something to keep an eye on in the long run.
Absolutely.
And this source certainly seems to be pushing a specific agenda.
Yeah.
I mean, world leaders telling people to prepare for civilization-ending events. That's some serious fear-mongering.
Absolutely. And it's important to understand how fear can be used to manipulate.
Right.
While we should be aware of potential risks and think about what we can control. It's also crucial to avoid getting caught up in a cycle of panic and anxiety.
So how do we find that balance between staying informed and not spiraling into a doomsday mindset?
That's a great question, and someone will definitely explore further.
Okay.
But for now, I think the key takeaway is that while this source raises some interesting points, it's essential to approach their claims with a critical eye.
Right.
And consider all sides of the story before jumping to conclusions.
Good advice.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like that classic line from Shakespeare. You know, present fears are less than horrible imaginings.
Right.
Sometimes the fear itself can be more damaging than the actual threat.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in the what-ifs and worst-case scenarios, especially when someone's laying it on thick like this source does.
Absolutely.
They really push this idea that we need to be prepared for all kinds of potential disasters, from economic collapse to all-out war.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to separate genuine preparedness from this kind of fear-mongering.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's not about dismissing potential threats altogether, but rather approaching them with a level head and a focus on what we can actually control.
So let's talk about that.
Okay.
What does responsible preparedness look like in this context?
Well, for starters, it's about building resilience. Not just reacting to fear. Think of it like strengthening your immune system. You're not trying to avoid every single germ, but rather giving your body the tools to fight off infections when they do occur.
So instead of stockpiling canned goods and building bunkers, which is what this source seems to be suggesting, we should be focusing on developing skills and resources that would be valuable in a wide range of situations.
Exactly. Things like learning basic first aid, having a plan for communicating with loved ones during an emergency, knowing how to grow some of your own food. These are all practical steps that can empower you. Regardless of what the future holds. It's about being proactive and adaptable, not just reactive and fearful.
I like that. It's about taking ownership of your own well-being and security, rather than feeling like a helpless victim of circumstance.
And it's not just about physical preparedness either. Mental and emotional resilience are equally important.
Yeah, that's true.
Being able to stay calm under pressure, adapt to changing circumstances, and maintain a sense of hope even when things get tough. These are invaluable skills in any situation, whether it's a natural disaster, an economic downturn, or a personal crisis.
That makes a lot of sense. So maybe this source, even with all their fear-mongering and questionable claims, has inadvertently stumbled upon something important.
Maybe so.
We may not need to go full-on doomsday prepper, but taking some practical steps to be more self-reliant and resilient is never a bad idea.
I think that's a valuable takeaway. It's about finding that balance between awareness and action without letting fear dictate our lives.
Well said. And speaking of things that can cause anxiety, this source really harps on the potential decline of the petrodollar. They make it sound like the U.S. dollar losing its dominance would be an economic apocalypse. Is it really that dire? What would a world without the petrodollar as the top dog actually look like?
Well, let's remember that economic systems are constantly evolving. The rise of other global powers, like China, and the increasing use of alternative currencies in international trade suggests that the U.S. dollar's reign might not last forever.
So maybe change is inevitable. But what would that actually mean for everyday people? Would our lives be drastically different if the dollar wasn't king of the hill anymore?
It's hard to predict the exact consequences. But any major shift away from the petrodollar would likely lead to some level of economic instability. At least in the short term. We could see a decline in the dollar's value, leading to inflation and a decrease in purchasing power.
So perhaps that's something we should be thinking about when we talk about preparedness. It's not just about surviving physical disasters, but also navigating potential economic shifts that could affect our livelihoods.
Precisely. Thinking about diversifying your income streams. Learning new skills that are in demand. And being adaptable to changing economic conditions. These are all forms of preparedness that could be extremely valuable in a world where the economic landscape is in flux.
It's about being proactive and taking control of your own destiny, rather than being at the mercy of external forces.
Absolutely.
But it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this. Where do we even begin?
I think it's important to remember that we're not alone in this. We're part of a global community. And we can learn from each other's experiences and support each other through challenging times.
That's a good point. We don't have to figure everything out on our own. There are resources, organizations, and communities out there that can provide guidance and support.
And remember, even small steps can make a big difference. It's not about becoming a survivalist expert overnight, but rather about gradually building resilience and adaptability into your life.
This source really likes to focus on the negative, highlighting all the potential threats and dangers lurking around every corner. But I think it's important to remember that we're not powerless in the face of these challenges. We can take steps to prepare ourselves both physically and mentally for whatever the future holds. We can engage in constructive dialogue and advocate for peaceful solutions. And most importantly, we can choose to focus on building a more resilient and equitable world. Rather than succumbing to fear and division.
I couldn't agree more. It's about recognizing our own agency and choosing hope over despair. Action over passivity.
Speaking of action, this source seems convinced that conflict between the U.S. and Iran is inevitable. Are we really on the brink of war?
The situation is definitely tense. And there are factors that could lead to further escalation. But it's important to remember that diplomacy and dialogue are still on the table.
Okay.
Both the U.S. and Iran have a vested interest in avoiding a full-blown conflict.
Right.
Which would be devastating for everyone involved.
So there's still hope for a peaceful resolution.
Absolutely. It will require both sides to exercise restraint.
Okay.
Engage in good faith negotiations, and be willing to compromise.
And it requires us as citizens to stay informed, engage in constructive conversation.
Absolutely.
And hold our leaders accountable for pursuing peaceful solutions.
Exactly. Diplomacy and peace building aren't spectator sports.
Right.
They require active participation.
Yeah.
And a commitment to finding common ground.
Well said. This has been a fascinating deep dive into a complex and often emotionally charged topic.
And I think it highlights the importance of critical thinking and informed decision-making, especially in a world where we're constantly bombarded with information from all sides.
We can't just accept everything we hear at face value.
Right.
Particularly when it comes to complex issues like geopolitics or economics.
Exactly.
We need to be willing to do our own research, consult multiple sources, and form our own conclusions.
And even if we don't have all the answers, even if the future feels uncertain, that process of engaging with the world in a thoughtful and critical way can be incredibly empowering.
Absolutely. It's about reclaiming our agency in a world that often feels overwhelming and chaotic.
Beautifully put. And on that note, I think it's time we shifted gears.
Okay.
And explore some concrete strategies for building resilience. And navigating an increasingly complex and unpredictable world.
So we've talked a lot about being prepared and resilient in a world that seems to throw more and more curveballs our way.
Yeah.
But where do we even begin? It can feel like a pretty daunting task.
I totally get that.
Yeah.
When you're constantly hearing about potential disasters and global crises, you know,
Right.
it's easy to feel overwhelmed or just want to tune it all out.
Yeah.
But the key is to break it down.
Okay.
Into smaller, more manageable steps.
Okay, so let's say I'm listening to this and thinking, all right, I need to get more prepared.
Right.
What are some practical first steps you'd recommend?
I always tell people to start with the basics. You know, put together a simple emergency kit.
Okay.
With things like water, non-perishable food, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a battery-powered radio.
Okay.
You'd be surprised how much peace of mind it gives you.
Yeah.
Just knowing you have those essentials on hand.
That makes sense. It's like a safety net just in case.
Exactly.
What about those bigger, more systemic threats that this source was so focused on? Like economic collapse or international conflict?
Yeah.
How do you prepare for that?
Those are definitely more complex issues.
Yeah.
And there's no quick fix.
Right.
But remember, preparedness is about building resilience.
Yeah.
Not just surviving one specific event.
Okay.
So think about skills and resources. That would be valuable in a variety of situations.
Like learning to grow your own food?
Exactly.
Developing practical skills like basic repairs or first aid? Maybe even learning a new language or trade.
Exactly. Diversifying your skill set and knowledge base is a form of preparedness in itself.
Right.
And don't underestimate the power of community.
Okay.
Building strong relationships with your neighbors, getting involved in local organizations, and working together to create more resilient communities can make a world of difference.
It really does take a village, doesn't it?
It does.
We're stronger when we support each other.
Absolutely.
But I think a lot of people struggle with finding that balance between being prepared and not getting sucked into a doomsday spiral.
Right.
How do you stay level-headed when you're surrounded by all this fear-mongering?
It's a valid concern. You know, it's easy to get caught up in the hype and start stockpiling weapons or building bunkers.
Right.
But to me, true preparedness is about empowerment, not paranoia.
Okay.
It's about taking practical steps to create a more secure and resilient future for ourselves and our communities.
Yeah.
While holding on to hope and optimism.
So it's about being informed about potential risks.
Yes.
Without letting fear control our actions.
Absolutely. It's about finding that sweet spot between awareness and action.
Right.
Without giving in to a sense of helplessness or despair.
You know, this whole deep dive has really given me a lot to think about.
Yeah, me too.
We started by unpacking a pretty intense and biased source.
Right.
And now we're talking about practical strategies for navigating an uncertain world.
Yeah, I think that's an important takeaway. We can't control everything that happens.
Right.
But we can control how we respond. We can choose to be proactive, informed, and engaged citizens, working together to create a more resilient and hopeful future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks.
And who knows, maybe by taking some of these steps to prepare ourselves, we can actually help prevent some of those worst-case scenarios that the source was so worried about.
It's definitely possible. The future isn't set in stone.
Right.
It's something we create together through our choices and actions.
Well, on that inspiring note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Yes, thank you for listening.
We hope you've learned something new and maybe even feel a little bit more empowered to face whatever challenges come your way.
Remember, knowledge is power.
Right.
And critical thinking is our most valuable tool.
Absolutely.
Stay curious, stay engaged.
Yes.
And keep diving deep.
Great advice. Thanks again.